Where in Australia are you going?
Sydney. We'll be living there.
I
I suppose this is another place you've been around. Yeah, you've really traveled the world, haven't you?
Yeah.
Is that via the Cato Institute, or is it other?
No, it's more local demand for some reason. I do lecture quite a lot all over the world, and I often accept when it's an exotic place. So, for a long time I had the idea that when I went out on my morning jog, running across from the other side of the opera, and then you see the Sydney Bridge and the Botanical Garden and the opera there and the water. That's the most beautiful spot on the planet. It's always shocked me.
How many times have you been invited down under?
Been to Australia twice, and one more time when I was going to New Zealand. But then Australia wasn't the main target.
So if we just think about your technical employment status, you're essentially a freelancer for a lot of different institutions. Is that a good way to think about it, or do you have direct employment?
For 15 years I've been freelance. So over a year I've got like 50 different employers.
Yeah.
When it comes to sort of magazines, publishers, places where I get invited to speak, basically. But nowadays I'm more affiliated with the Cato Institute and work more directly for them, but from a distance.
And so it's really serendipity that drives whatever the next exciting thing on your calendar might be. Are you actively seeking it out, or it's just you are at this point have a level of notoriety and expertise on X amount of subjects that they come to you?
It's a combination, but mostly it's driven by demand rather than supply.
Okay.
It's more driven by someone wants me to speak on a subject that's relevant to them, and then using whatever expertise I might have in the vicinity, basically. But then again, when I also pitch ideas for my agent and publisher, sort of what am I thinking about? What am I curious about? And I'm curious about 5 things. Can we turn one of them into a book? Sure. And then they help me to filter it out.
You've been really prolific in the amount of books you've published, to say nothing of all the articles on the site as well.
Yeah, for a long time I said it's because I read fast, I write fast, and I never sleep.
That's quite a combination.
But nowadays I do sleep, so it takes a bit longer. Yeah. But it's really, I think it's because it comes from a place of curiosity and personal interest, and that helps to get things done.
And I read in your Wikipedia page that you were a something anarchist, a industrial anarchist, or...
That sounds much better.
Okay, yeah.
It was probably an anti-industrial.
Yes, that sounds about right.
At that time.
It was a pretty hardcore title, but one gets the sense that, ever since you were in your late teens, you were very interested in, the philosophy of how does this world work, and therefore what's the right place to be reading. So have you been a voracious reader and consumer since you were, in your teens?
Oh yeah, I was, and back then I understood the world much better than I do now. Now naturally. much more confused, obviously. But yeah, I always had that urge to sort of find out what's wrong and to try to get things to work better. And I didn't find that at school or with friends, so I had to go to books and libraries. So I read constantly. Yeah. I'm afraid to say often back in those days, more trying to find something that I recognized, someone who thought a little bit like me, rather than the other way around, sort of trying to learn something. That took some time to be a good reader rather than just a ferocious reader.
And so when you shed your anarchism and moved a little bit more towards classical liberalism, who was the first person where you read them and thought, wow, they have now painted a picture of the world, which I really, really am starting to agree with?
That's a good question, because it really started with me not finding it there. I was an anarchist. I even started sort of in my high school days, a small anarchist party. Failed miserably on the national stage. But when I read the classical anarchists, the Kropotkins and the Bakunins and so on, they weren't all that I hoped them to be. More sounded like small, suffocating communities and collectives. It wasn't this sort of libertarian individualist urge that I was searching for. So that got me interested in classical liberalism. And this sounds weird, but I got started with sort of Adam Smith and Richard Cobden and John Bright, the 18th century and mid-19th century classical liberals, because they were the only ones I found in the library. This was before the internet, so I didn't find anything that was more sort of relevant to present concerns. And their ideas made sense, and I enjoyed it, but my heart wasn't really in it, because I still had this sort of romantic, fairly anti-industrial, anti-modernist agenda of more ecological, more going back to nature, anarchist urge. So it was
a bit of a Luddite urge.
Yes, and they were so obsessed with economics, and I couldn't really understand why. Why is that so important? It doesn't sound like much fun, because to me it felt like this was where I started. Long way from where I ended up, with thinking that we are probably not living the best kind of lives nowadays, with the hustle and bustle of modernism and urban life and big industry and commuting and stuff. We ought to find something better. And I thought we would find that in the past. That was when I thought that my ancestors lived ecologically rather than died ecologically at a very young age. But so that got me interested in the classical liberals, but my heart wasn't in it until I read Ayn Rand, the Russian-American novelist and philosopher, and especially her fiction, because what she did was that she pointed out that there's romance and adventure in achievement and hard work and technology and engineering and building bridges and skyscrapers, and I hadn't understood that until then. No one had explained that to me, and that really helped me to sort of make peace with the modern world.
Has the idea of writing a fictional story where you could completely romanticize a similar Randian figure, just for your own posterity, to have produced, in my worldview, this is the life well lived, and he's the protagonist of this fictional story.
What makes you think that I haven't already done that?
Oh, apologies. Maybe I
haven't published it.
Okay,
it's just in the drawer somewhere. Yeah. No, it doesn't get interesting when I try to do that. It's a little bit too programmatic. It's a little bit too, when I read fiction, I love nuanced characters and complex relationships. And when I sit down to try to write something fictional, trying to portray my worldview, it's not that nuanced. So I'd better think that through.
But is that just your own sort of humility and insecurity talking, or has an editor said to you, no, we need the supporting characters as well?
Oh, it's my insecurity, because I haven't really even showed it to an editor.
Well, if you're comfortable sharing, could you give us the cliff notes of this protagonist?
I really am not. No.
Okay.
Sorry.
Just one detail then. Is he a Swede?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Well then, I suppose we can bookmark it there. How does it feel that for people 20, 30 years younger than you, coming into their own intellectual maturity, might pick up the Capitalist Manifesto or any one of your many books and fundamentally have their worldview changed?
It's a strange and very humbling experience. And of course, it's something that that's a reason why I write. I am a bit of a missionary. I want to, I know this doesn't sound very humble, but I'm trying to save civilization. I'm trying to make the world a better place. I'm so full of gratitude to all those who came before me, from the philosophers to the engineers who created the world we're now living in, and for all its troubles, it's the best civilization so far, with least share of world population in extreme poverty, illiteracy, longest life expectancy ever, and so on. And I want to try to at least repay some of that debt by doing my bit to speak up for the institutions that I think protects this civilization. So obviously that's something that I'm trying to achieve. When I'm writing my books, when I'm giving my lectures and doing my documentaries, I'm trying to affect people, and often people who might be thinking what I thought when I was in my late teens or something like that. So I want to change worldviews. Mm-hmm. But then obviously it's always a strange thing when you actually learn that you've had an impact.
Yeah. How do you manage your inbox, or rather, even how does it feel when you roll out of bed in the morning, reload your email, and there's 2 or 3 guys, someone in Pakistan, someone in Mexico, and 2 Australians who have written to you and said something overwhelming that's hard to tackle?
To me, it's a tremendous boost of energy. Yeah. That's really. You can probably relate when you're sitting there you don't see your audience and you're writing or you're talking. You don't know if you're really having an impact. Just sending it into the big sort of vacuum out there. And it's wonderful to get that feedback. Whether it's short or long, or they want something or just want to say hello and thank you, it's wonderful. That keeps me going, and I'm trying to always respond.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's happening at a significantly less scale on my end, but a couple times a week I'll get a message and I'll think, holy hell, this is such an interesting person. I'm so grateful that they took the time to just say, I'm listening, I liked it. Because you have no idea how rewarding that is to feel. Because absolutely, I mean, you're in a Stockholm apartment, pumping out a book.
Yeah.
And there's, 8 billion people in the world that could potentially read that thing. And obviously, this is well documented, but we can't comprehend these numbers at scale. We can't actually imagine what does 8 billion people look like. It's probably 100x bigger than your biggest imagination you could think of it.
Quite right. And to me, it's also, I know that I rarely, far too seldom, get in touch with people who've done good things, written stuff or done podcasts or whatever that I truly enjoyed. Mostly you let people know when they've done a mistake. so it really means something when they've actually taken the time to get in touch and say, I enjoyed that. And it probably then you understand that this is multiplied out there.
We're going to bookmark a question I just wrote down because I think actually this is a perfect transition to a question that I had later. But I mean, talking about a random person popping into your inbox, you get the endorsement of one Elon Musk not too long ago. How has his association with you affected your life?
Well, it's affected my book sales, for one. I could see that in real time. The moment that he tweeted to his 170 million followers or
over
whatever
200
it
now.
is. Okay, God. A substantial share of them bought the book suddenly. And of course, that's the kind of... it's funny because just 2 days before or something like that, I was at an institution in Washington, D.C. and talked to another author who said that, you know what, it's not the reviews anymore. It's about someone who's also an influencer suddenly coming across the book and talking about it. That makes a difference. And then 2 days later, Elon Musk did that. So yeah, that had an impact.
Well, not to get too airy-fairy, but thank goodness that author put that out into the world somehow for Elon Musk to pick up on it. Had you any indication that he was consuming your work before that was posted?
I had learned that in some tech circles, and some people in Silicon Valley were reading the book and enjoying it and reading my work generally. And it feels like his circles are sort of, there's a crossover somewhere there. So yeah, I knew that I was probably on his radar.
I mean, he's famously very tight with Daniel Ek. This is a fellow Swede, a fellow Stockholmer. Do you ever speak to Spotify, speak to institutions Daniel's involved in?
No, I don't. We don't all know one another.
Okay.
Because we're Swedes. I know it seems like we're all second cousins, but no, surprisingly little.
Okay. So book sales clearly massive spike. What about some of the serendipity that maybe has come in from the increase in your notoriety and your public profile because of that boost?
Well, I'm yet to find out. I guess
still too early to say.
Yeah, that you know, the second thing I notice after sort of the book sales is that suddenly I get invitations to do lectures in strange exotic places, and because people pay attention to Elon Musk and his circles, so that happens.
Give us a sense for strange and exotic. What's at the top of this list here?
Well, the kind of people who are working on biotechnically engineering our drinks to make us smarter and that kind of stuff. People who are working more like in science fiction. At least that's what it sounds like to me than doing just science.
I think you had a nice turn of phrase when you recently interviewed Elon, saying that he's taking the fiction out of science fiction.
Right. Yeah.
And potentially as well, some of these people that you're meeting and some of the extremely out-of-the-box, innovative things people are working on, our next 30, 40 years on this planet could well be the most transformational in, our species' history. Yeah. It's tremendously exciting to think about.
Yeah, I hope so. I'm interested in the bizarre and the weird, because I've learned from history that every innovation is an act of rebellion against the way we used to do things. So anything from the crops and artificial fertilizer to the digital communications that we're using seemed like science fiction once upon a time. And now we're there again. I think in biotechnology, mRNA technology, CRISPR, AI generally, it's weird. And we don't really get it. And that's what keeps civilization going. That's how we stay young and dynamic, I think, by being constantly surprised. I'm excited.
One final thing, the serendipity, right? It's a moment of serendipity that Elon's boosting your signal. But just throughout your life, even when you're younger, are there marked moments of serendipity that have fundamentally changed the future for you?
Oh, for sure. It's interesting how we're constantly writing our own autobiography, I think, in our head, because, people are asking me, so how did you start doing this? And I've told the story so many times that I don't know if I remember my memories of it or whether I remember what actually happened. But
what's actually the truth? Yeah,
exactly. And I think you're constructing a sort of a path, a very logical sequence of events, and this got me there and so on. But when I'm really going back and when I'm reading my far too few diary notes and stuff like that, it's that weird phone call I got from that person who asked me to do this. Can I really do that? And met that guy over there who was into this, and we suddenly became friends and started cooperating and things like that. So I think it's not all serendipity, because it's also sort of the surface area of possibility and serendipity that makes it happen. So you've got to be prepared for it. But to me, more than half were complete surprises to me once I did it.
Soren Kierkegaard said that life can be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. So exactly. You can easily trace the path going back. Wow, obviously it was going to be this way, or I can see why it changed this way. But That's also an extremely exciting thing, because as you sit here right now and face the infinite possibilities of the future, there is no cap on what could happen, as there is also no depth.
Yeah, no, that's right, and that's something that sometimes it's a little bit scary. Obviously, the world is changing, your work is changing, people around you are changing, the demand for what you're doing is changing, and that's often scare. How do you navigate in this world? I think that's something as individuals or organizations, we're always facing that. And to me, therefore, I think it's often important to, I learned this from Jason Pfeiffer of the Entrepreneur magazine, to often tell yourself, when was the last time you started to love something that you truly feared or hated? Because to me, that has happened so many times in my life. New technologies that I had to learn, or new places, new people, lecturing, that's one of the most important things that I'm doing. I hated that. I used to hate giving lectures. I was terrified and I was awful. I was really bad at it. But I felt like I had to do it because I had a message that I wanted to promote. So as a, late teenage sort of anarchist / libertarian, I went to all the lectures because I had to tell people stuff. And it was awful and it was terrible. But I got better, specifically because of all my mistakes and all my failures, and I learned how to do it, how to navigate. I got better, and I didn't know what happened, but suddenly I started enjoying it, and suddenly there was a demand for me to do it in on all different kinds of subjects. And I think that's important, to look at all the stuff that we used to hate that we now love. That's the way of not being afraid of the future and the surprises that comes next.
And the tremendous upside of taking that risk, the fear of speaking in front of a crowd.
Yeah.
How many great lecturers never stood foot on the stage to know that they were a great lecturer.
Exactly. I wouldn't have done this. I would never have done it if it wasn't for the fact that I just felt that I had to get my weird message across. And I guess that's partly serendipity. I forced myself into circumstances to do that. I had no idea that this would be a sort of paid gigs in the future. Lots of people, if you don't have that drive, why would you go through the first 100 lectures that you hate until you start enjoying it, until you start loving it? So, yeah.
So, something you both love and fear. Is anything very tangible top of mind right now that would fit into that box?
Yeah, lots of stuff all the time. AI, for one. I'm theoretically excited. It's like, as an old Star Trek fan, this is the supercomputer on board the Enterprise. It's got the accumulated knowledge of mankind and other species and Vulcans and Klingons, and you just pose your questions, and it's got the greatest potential, but it ruins my work. I like to think that I'm good at doing research. I read lots of stuff. I'm good at, I think, extracting what's valuable from large amounts of text, and to analyze and to use it for my purposes and to write. Now, someone invents a machine that gets people to sort of give me the 10 most important things from this book straight away. That's cheating. Isn't that awful? It sort of ruins my unique selling point.
Your edge.
Yeah. So part of me says that I don't want to use that. And sort of originally I told some people that with pride, sort of, I haven't used ChatGPT one bit in writing this book, because I want to show that I can do it the old-fashioned way. And that's obviously the way that you begin to deteriorate as a writer and a speaker, because you're not using the tools that are accessible to you, just because you have this fancy schmancy idea of the way it used to be done. Obviously, that's how the scribes got unemployed once the printing press got going. So I'm trying to tell myself, look, I probably said the same thing about about email once upon a time. Right. This will ruin it all. I used to do it over the phone or letters and nice stuff. And now I love it and couldn't live without it. So I think ChatGPT is another thing that I fear that I will come to love once I go through the effort, the investment in time to start learning how can I use this in a good way.
So the printing press creates mass unemployment for scribes before. The internet creates mass unemployment because so many jobs before just now are not necessary, or one person can do the work of 5 before because they have the tools of the internet. AI, again, extraordinarily disruptive. Could you give the case for why it might not actually lead to mass employment and the destruction of civilization at the other end of that?
Yeah. Well, the easiest way to make the case is to look at these previous waves of technological innovation that we've had. We all used to work in agriculture, and we could barely sustain ourselves and produce enough food. And suddenly we go from 80% in working in agriculture to less than 2%. Does that mean that 78% of the population is unemployed? Well, obviously not, because what happened was that also drives down the price of food. Suddenly we can feed ourselves at a lower cost. We get all that work done better, easier, with better crops and artificial fertilizer and irrigation systems and diesel tractors and stuff. And in that case, we still have all that purchasing power. Actually, we've got more purchasing power now because we don't have to spend as much of it on food as we did before. And that is now liberated to buy all that labor back, but somewhere else. And then we started doing it in manufacturing and lots of manufactured goods. So suddenly we could get furniture and clothes. And instead of doing, recently met an Indian man from Delhi who said that, when he was growing up, he had a total number of 1 shirts that he shared with his 3 brothers. So when someone was going for dinner or a job interview, he got to wear the shirt that day. That's the way we all used to live. 1 shirt was luxury, and now we can afford that. And then we start to get the same technological innovation in manufacturing, and we automate it. And so suddenly people can leave manufacturing. Does that mean we get unemployed there? Yes, for a while, temporarily, until we retrain and new generations start to do something else. Because now we can afford those things, shirts and shoes and furniture at a cheaper price. So we have all that purchasing power liberated so that we can buy something else. And suddenly we can afford healthcare and education and podcasts and more books and documentaries, and people can be employed there. And I'm sure the same thing will happen unless we run out of needs and ambitions and interests in doing something. We will always want people to do something for us, and if we run out of that, then we don't have to work anymore. But
then the real questions begin.
Exactly, that will be the difficult one. But so there's always a transition, and that can be difficult, and that's one reason why I think we need sort of open, dynamic labor markets and economies so that we quickly transfer capital and labor to new areas. But often it happens within our work as well, within a single person's work. I talked about how AI is disrupting me. So did the internet. I used to think that my edge was to find the right books and magazine articles and papers. And because I had this great method, I was quick. I was going to the Royal Library in Stockholm and going through all the old catalogs and finding the microfilm of old articles.
Oh, wow.
And that was a treasure trove because nobody else
was doing that work.
No, they probably didn't go to the effort, and they used with whatever material they had at hand. So that was great. I thought that made me a tremendous researcher and writer. Now Google does that for me in seconds. So suddenly at least 50% of my job was automated. It means that a new innovation that made me 50% unemployed. And that happens again and again in many areas. But obviously what that meant was that I could stop doing that the hassle, the routine work that wasn't really sophisticated, and instead spend that 50% of my time in reading more, doing the analysis and sharpening my own theories on the subject. And I think that's often what happens in a technological transition, and I'm sure that's what will happen with AI as well.
Could you provide a more pessimistic outcome for it? Or is it the case that if we are to just somehow project the future based off how these technological disruptions have happened in the past, that you're not even prepared to excite it?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I sped through these transitions. There were some difficulties and some bumps on the road there as well. You know, the waves of urbanization that we got when agriculture was becoming increasingly productive was obviously traumatic as well. Whole areas of our countries abandoned by people looking for employment once the tractors
tremendous cultural change.
Yeah, and we've had the same with some of the deindustrialization as well, you know, by accident and sometimes by sort of historical path dependence. Some areas just happen to be centers of manufacturing. And suddenly, once we can do that easier, cheaper, with not just international competition or something, but just the fact that we automated it meant that lots and lots of people lost their jobs and had to do something else. And obviously that was a shock and traumatic for those involved. So even though we're moving in the right direction, we're always doing things better and smarter so that we can liberate more time and labor to sort of level up to the next stage of the human experience. It is difficult when that happens to you. And you know, even though we can make that happen with 5% unemployment, when it happens to you, it's not 5%, it's 100%. Yes. So there are some risks, obviously, when we get AI going, if it happens to many sectors big time at the same time. On the other hand, if we don't do it, we know for a fact what will happen. You know, the Luddites that succeeded. There were areas of England where the Luddites managed to scare the factory owners not to use this machinery. And they were soon desolated and had no employment whatsoever because other parts of the country, other parts of the world would use those technologies.
So in the face of the negative consequences of this change, one still has to adopt their own agency because change is constant. And if you don't change with it, and insist on what it was before, it's a very risky maneuver because it could leave you totally behind. You as an author, for instance, if you decide, you know what, all these new AI tools, fuck it, I don't need that. You know, you could very well succeed from it, but it's an extremely risky play. Rather, change with it, try adopt, try constantly be ahead of where everyone else is. But again, that sort of falls very neatly into a Randian worldview.
Yeah, sure it does. But I think this is an incredibly important point because my reading of history and my next book project is on golden ages throughout history. And, you know, what at least subsequent generations would term golden ages, eras of cultural flourishing, scientific discovery, technological innovation, economic growth, from ancient Athens to China under the Song dynasty to the early Dutch Republic. Tremendous moments in time when people were subtly exploring in strange new ways and coming up with everything from great art to new financial institutions that we're all in their debt nowadays. But one of the most depressing things about it is that those periods are short. And they're called golden ages because what came next wasn't golden. You return to the same place. Travelers go back into those areas and say, what happened here? It's the same people, the same tradition, same language, same religion, but that spark is suddenly gone. And now there's not excitement. It's unemployment, and we're back to hunger and drudgery. What happened? So to me, the reading of history there is that our greatest fear shouldn't be change and constant change and development. It should be the greatest risk throughout history has always been stagnation, and that we revert to the mean, which is awful. So that's what we have to avoid.
And you're saying that on a societal level, or that's more of a message to the individual operating within the society?
I think it's both. Certainly for the individual, it's easy to say, I don't want to use these technologies. They are, it's undignified to use the printing press or AI. Then that's the beginning of the end, right? But the same goes for societies as well, for organizations and for economies and for whole societies, because they often, I think there's a great status quo filter in a way, because change is uncomfortable and it disrupts everything that we're doing. And it's uncomfortable to elites in societies because they've built their power on certain structures. It's uncomfortable to you as an individual. It's uncomfortable for the incumbents in business, in labor unions.
Imagine the uncertainty for an incumbent.
Yeah, absolutely. If you can freeze this moment in time, that's great, right? But that's the beginning of the end. And that's when you revert to this long stagnation that we had for thousands of years in most places. And it's only now, since really the Industrial Revolution, the first revolution that never ended, that we've got this continuously emergent novelty. And that's partly because we started to create more open societies, more open economies, so that even if I, as an individual or a society, didn't want this new technology, somebody else would do that and give us this Sputnik moment when they show that, okay, if you don't do it, we'll do it. That forces us to step up and continue to explore these new technologies and business models and what have you. And that feels like a lot of stress. And we need that stress because otherwise we'll relax and then we will die.
And not to say something too eye-rolly or too cliche, but as well, in the face of that stress and that uncertainty is really sort of the adventure of your life, potentially. The giant risks you will take, and therefore, hopefully, some of the meaning you'll be able to find in our fleeting years on this planet.
Yeah, I spoke to a psychologist recently who told me that they have found a group of people who never feel stress in their lives. They're trying to explore, is this genetic, or is it because they've developed a lifestyle where they never sense this stress? Felt great until they realized something else about this group. They're basically always bored with life. And that tells you all you've got to know about this. And I think, to me, when I look back upon my life, sort of what have I done that felt sort of really meaningful and exciting? It's rarely the moments when I didn't feel stress. It's rarely the moments when I relaxed. And we need that too, to sort of recharge. And we need that on a regular basis as well. But the moments when I felt that I've done something important and meaningful and exciting, from bringing up children into this world or writing a book or standing on a stage and talking to important people, that was always terrifying. And it was always something new. And I think there's a lesson there for all of us.
I felt exactly that, not to be too personal here, but I felt exactly that actually this morning, because I've been anticipating this interview for a long time. It's been months since, we connected and we were going to record it. And typically I'm recording soon after I've read the book and very soon after I've reached out to them. And so there isn't enough time for anticipation and anxiety to hit. And so, yeah, I felt that this morning more so than I really would ever for an interview. But then it's like, fuck it, just do it, because I know you're going to feel better and very stoked you had done it, once it's done. And obviously that's just a microcosm, but
and it works well so far.
Yeah. So the economies of scale of agriculture, what is the capitalist solution to the problem of the competitive fight to the most marginal efficiency, where, for instance, now most of our meat especially is pumped full of antibiotics, raised in the antithesis of nature. It seems like in this hyper efficient market, there is a lot of negative externality that's not accurately priced into the final product. So is this one a fault of this capitalist urge? And if so, is there a solution within the capitalist worldview? Or could it be government regulation?
Yeah, well, this is generally, if we speak on the most abstract level first, because I haven't seen the documentary, this is one place where there's a role for governments to deal with externalities. The whole idea of a free market is you make your own decisions, but you also have a responsibility for your decisions. If you succeed, great, you'll get to keep the fruits of your labor. If you fail, it's your investment and you have to fail. It's a profit and loss system, and that's how we continue to emerge and develop new and better ideas, because failure is not failure, it's data. It's a lesson on how to improve and do better things. But it also means that you have to internalize the costs. You should pay for it, for the damage you're doing, for the losses you're making. And this is obviously a place where we constantly fail in our modern political system, where we bail out all the failures from financial companies to industrial companies that do not keep up with others, so they should be allowed to fail. But one externality is that you're imposing costs on others in your everyday behavior. And if you pollute, if you destroy the forests, the groundwater, or the lungs of somebody else, then you should pay for that. That's the real sort of free market capitalist solution to problems. If you impose a cost on people through global warming with your the engines or your livestock, you should pay for it with a greenhouse gas tax. That would, in the best of possible worlds, you should pay directly to all those who are damaged, rather than just to be a cash cow for governments. Now that's, and when it comes to antibiotics, if that slips into the groundwater in places, you should pay for that damage for two reasons. First of all, to compensate for those who lose out, but also to stop you from doing that, to get you to start thinking about how can we do this in a better way and without imposing these costs on others. And it's difficult to do that through a sort of a going to courts. The transaction costs is pretty dramatic, especially when it comes to global warming, with sort of couple of billion people in a class action suit against those who pollute. So there I see a role for governments to basically just impose a financial penalty on those who impose costs on others. That's also complex, how you do that in every single instance. And so that's complex, and I don't have the precise answers, but it's better to be vaguely right than exactly wrong, I think. So trying to impose systems like that, polluter pay principles, basically, is a good incentive in a market economy.
If we're just talking theoretically, you still think that the pricing mechanism is the ultimate regulator and provider of incentives, but it's in the failure of the pricing mechanism to be assigned, whether it's through local corruption or the courts getting involved, or just an inability to accurately calculate what these externalities are. This is where all the inefficiencies start to breed.
Yeah. And often you don't want to impose a carbon tax, for example, because a tax sounds bad, and it's feels more nice for American politicians to say, let's just subsidize all the green technologies that we like, rather than imposing a penalty on those who pollute. And that's a failure in every single way, because that also puts governments in a much worse position of trying to pick winners when it comes to green technologies. And, they can't even pick winners when it comes to traditional manufacturing, but trying to predict the next step of technological innovation. I mean, not even the people involved, the researchers and the entrepreneurs, have any idea of what's going to succeed next. So why would politicians and bureaucrats who don't even risk their own money and who always have other incentives, and they want to put all those jobs for some reason in their own constituency and so on and so on. It's just this is what breeds crony capitalism and lots of not just bad financial outcomes, but also bad in terms of what it buys. Mm-hmm. It buys this dependence on certain technologies that politicians just happen to prefer to something else. It's much better with a broad, general, overall incentive to everybody. Try to come up with better ways to reduce pollution. But we don't know. You don't know. Start experimenting. And that's my worldview generally. To me, classical liberalism, free market capitalism is based on Socratic wisdom. I have no idea. But I know, I'm smarter than others because I know what I don't know. Right. Whereas the problem with other ideologies is that they think they know.
They have all the answers.
And that's, we can only learn more by having more experiments, more trial and error, and then answers will emerge that will be a little bit better than what we know today.
Tell me if this tracks with your worldview, but imposing these accurate costs for the negative externalities, stick to the agricultural example, is more achievable with smaller scale, smaller community, less people involved, easier to actually calculate what those externalities are. And even if that's blown up to a country as big as 350 million people, the United States, potentially still manageable. But the scale of people makes all of these problems significantly harder to calculate. And we now operate in a globalized world, globalized economy. So how on earth are we to actually properly calculate in the pricing mechanism a negative externality for, say, having my genes produced in Bangladesh versus Sweden? Isn't it the case that we are just simply offshoring our negative externality elsewhere? Because we share the same planet. So the negative externality there is still felt here. Yeah. Although now it's been evacuated from the actual final price we get. First of all, does any of that make sense?
Some of it. Okay. Does. First of all, I absolutely agree that it's easier to implement rational institutions on a small scale, where, the great economist Elinor Ostrom has pointed out that a way of dealing traditionally with these kinds of problems with negative externalities in the commons or among neighbors. It's just that people get together and start to discuss and negotiate, and surprisingly often coming up with great ways of sort of, if your livestock is sort of entering this territory and I use it for this reason, let's do it this way and you compensate me that way and so on. People often, when they're able to negotiate and experiment, come up with better solutions than you could ever expect them to. Now, how do we do that on a global scale? Well, we don't, because suddenly it's not exactly the persons involved doing the negotiations. They're not even in negotiations. It's government structures and stuff like that, and it will be fairly suboptimal in lots of ways. And I guess we have to realize that the world isn't perfect, and we have to come up with something approaching at least better solutions if we live on the same planet and we affect the same commons, like, for example, the atmosphere and stuff like that. Then I think we have to accept that people will come up with different solutions. Won't be perfect. They won't go to the same efforts in Bangladesh that we are doing in an economy that's 20 times richer, because they still face the problems that we did in early industrialization, where it's not a matter of... It's more a matter of sort of, will you afford to put your kids to school, or do you take care of these externalities? Well, you might have to make the transition and actually do some damage that you wouldn't accept later on when you've solved the most urgent existential problems of putting food on the table, until you do get the better, perfect solutions when it comes to broader externalities. And I think we should have give them some slack, because we made different choices back then as well. What we can do is help them getting there by opening our markets for their goods, so that they, which sounds in the first instance like that's a bad choice, because they're making choices that we wouldn't do when it comes to the environment. Well, yeah, but it's by doing that that they will get the resources that they can get other things done, and most of all get the technology and the management that will help them to get to the next level faster than we did once upon a time. I often think about the fact that 150 years ago, Sweden was as poor as Bangladesh. And if France and England and the rich countries of the world would have said that, look, we don't want your jeans, or back then, your timber, paper, iron ore, because you're still so poor and you're making bad decisions and you're ruining the environment, why don't you stay back there? We stop you from exporting and go away and become rich somehow in some other way, and then get back in a better shape, and then we'll buy your timber and your iron ore. Well, in that case, we would still have child labor in our factories, and we would still ruin our nature, because it was only by getting rich and dealing with the problems of feeding our kids and giving them an education that we could start caring about the environment in a serious way.
So then, on the other end of that, it is still the right course of action that, whether it's Sweden or Australia or France, might impose these heavy environmental regulations, even though it means that work will just be done elsewhere without those environmental regulations, because we're in the position to actually afford that downside, in the optimistic hope that eventually it'll all sort itself out anyway. There's just going to be quite a lot of efficiency along the way.
Yeah. I think that that's the way to go about things. It doesn't mean that we're just pushing all the kind of manufacturing jobs out there. I mean, we're producing more manufacturing goods in Sweden and the US than we did in 1980. It's just that we do it in a more efficient and in a more automated,
skilled
way.
It's
the old story about the factory of the future just has two workers. It's a man and a dog. And the man is there to guard the dog, and the dog is there to stop the guy from interfering with the machinery, because it takes care of all of that. And so, I mean, we've gone through a green transition when it comes to manufacturing and in our parts of the world as well, and yet been able to produce more than ever before. But there's still this kind of low capital and lesser educational, knowledge-intensive production when it comes to everything from agriculture, textiles, and shoes that can be done in Bangladesh and so on. And it's a great thing that happens. This is one of the reasons why we've seen the fastest poverty reduction that the world has ever seen in the past 30 years. It's been an amazing ride. More than 100,000 people have been lifted out of extreme poverty every day.
Is that a fact every day?
Over the past 20 years, 140,000 people were lifted out of extreme poverty every day. And where did that happen? It happened in the countries that started to integrate into the global economy. So it happened in Bangladesh, it happened in Indonesia, it happened in Vietnam, it happened in India and China and so on. And this is, I think we will look back at this period and say that was a golden age, because never before in human history have so many people been lifted out of poverty that quickly. And that obviously also gives them the resources and the interest to start to think about other issues and environmental issues and global issues as well.
I think the reason why the environmental externality is so much more acute than any other externality is just because the downside is uncapped.
Yeah.
You know, a more local externality, worst case scenario, it might ruin a few people, ruin a village, but globally our species remains intact. But you can't run an iterative experiment so many times.
Good point.
On a global
Yeah.
So I think that maybe, I mean, whether it's explicitly understood or not, drives so much of the attention towards environmental protection.
Sure. And I mean, I love failure. I love trial and error and failures. That's what we learn the most from. But obviously, we don't want to fail when it comes to the global commons and things like the global climate, because we might only have one chance. So that's an area where we've got to get things right. So how do we do that? Well, we've been talking about how we can internalize the externalities and create those incentives. But that's just the path to better technologies, green technologies, better non-fossil fuels and energy sources. And we're getting there. We know, or at least we know the potential that's out there. We know even how we can capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and store it back here or make use of it back here. It's just too costly to do this now at a global scale. What do we do when things are too costly? Well, we don't engage in degrowth, because that will just focus people's minds on, oh gosh, how can I save my job, or how can I feed my kids? We do it by more technological innovation that gets these things, reduce the price of it all, and more growth so that we can afford it. And this is not just a pipe dream. It's not just sort of a theoretical possibility. It is happening right now. You know, there are 40 countries around the world that have managed to reduce their carbon dioxide in absolute terms in the past few decades. And they just so happens to be the richest and the most democratic free market economies on the planet, because they're the richest. They can afford the incentives. They can afford the technologies. And slowly and steadily, that's trickling down to economies that are becoming richer right now. You can see that in the carbon intensity of economies. How much carbon does it take for them to produce 1 unit of GDP? Well, when you compare where we were when we were industrializing the fastest, the next pack of sort of East Asian economies, when they did the same thing, they only had about half of the carbon intensity that we had back then, because they can now do it with technologies that had been developed in richer countries but are now spreading around the world. The next group that's industrializing right now in Africa, in North Africa, in the Middle East, and Southern Asia and so on, they do it at a level of carbon intensity that's just a third of what it was when we did the same thing.
That's an incredible statistic.
So that's wonderful. Yeah. It should bring cheers
Absolutely.
Around the
world. A lot of optimism.
That's happening.
Yeah.
However, that's not enough, because we're still, even though, I mean, soon we'll see some reduction in the world population, but it takes some time. For a while longer, there will be more of us and more countries becoming richer, so they're producing more. So the fact that every single unit of GDP is done with less carbon intensity doesn't help us. We're still increasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But it shows you that we are on the same track, and that we should really sort of step on the accelerator rather than step on the brake.
Yeah. Is it the case, just from all the research you're doing, that we are stepping on the brake, or are you still optimistic that the accelerator is firmly to the floor?
There are some worrying trends. There are some smart people engaging in the most stupid ideas that I've ever heard of, that we should really do degrowth and sort of start to relax and have less
set limits
innovation.
On population.
Yeah, and that would really be a nightmare for people, for poverty, for hunger around the world, but also I think for the environment. We've seen that. We've had some countries that are actually engaged in degrowth, not by choice, but by accident. Portugal and Greece during the Euro crisis, they actually increased the carbon intensity in their economies because they couldn't invest in new technologies and new machinery. So there are some worrying trends in the debate. I hope it's not happening. I still see that people are interested in growth. But, the fear of disruption in the economy, of new business models and technologies might lead us into making the wrong choices.
Yeah. Okay, we're going an hour. Haven't really touched on many of the things. We can leave that for another time. Obviously, I think largely, having consumed your work, we definitely share a worldview. But nonetheless, there are a few, and so globalization is a net good, but there are still things worth pointing out that could potentially be consequential, if not direly consequential. One of them being is the sort of cultural uniformity that is the outcome of globalization. Because if we're now operating in one marketplace and everyone is operating at wherever their best competitive advantage is, then most of the textiles might be made in one place, most of the machinery in one place, and even most of the media sort of kind of in one place. And therefore, we lose whatever is this magic about going into a place that feels completely different. And so that could be a pretty disastrous, just cultural downside of this globalization. Would you agree with that? And is there an alternative take?
I would agree that there is that downside. I would also argue that this is a great thing. Not to us as tourists. We want to explore the exciting and strange and exotic in other places. But the world is not our museum. And I think we have to tell ourselves that, especially as globetrotters who are sort of trying to find something exciting. We have to understand that the world is not just a playground. I learned that when I will never forget this. I was about to say that just before I forgot where it was. But I think this was Prague after the fall of communism. And they got in the old town a McDonald's. And I remember this American who just talked to the locals and said, that's terrible. This is such a shame. This used to be so different and amazing and awful in some ways, of course, but also it used to be so strange. Now you're just like us Americans. And what I will never forget is the reaction by one of the locals who told him that that's the most sort of derogatory, awful thing that she had ever heard from someone. To assume that they would freeze their country in time as a museum for them to explore, to see something different. No, they live in a real society, and they want new choices and alternatives as well. So yes, there is that downside. I don't much enjoy sort of seeing the Starbucks and the McDonald's everywhere where I go on trips. But that's not for me to make those choices, I don't think. It's for, as people get more freedoms, they will make choices that I don't like. but I like the fact that they get to make those choices because it's their society. Now, what changes is not necessarily that societies become more homogeneous, but that they become more heterogeneous within their own societies, because suddenly next to that McDonald's you will have that local Czech shop and suddenly a sushi bar. And what's interesting is that in Stockholm you will also find that Czech restaurant as well. So we'll get more of those alternatives and choices and exoticism within our societies. And if you compare most of the cities that I've experienced now and when I grew up, most of the towns in Sweden, we had Swedish restaurants and a pizzeria. That was it. and that was, now it's full of cultural creativity and alternatives. So the world has suddenly come to us as well. And I think that there's something wonderful about that. There's a downside as well. When we go abroad, we will see, oh, it's just the same cultural creativity that we find back home.
The same Chinese crap in every store.
Right. And that's a downside. Perhaps that will lead us to travel less and explore our own societies more. I don't know.
I don't have any opinion on this, but I just wonder whether it's something you've spoken to other people about or thought about yourself. But taking it one step further from the physical product homogeneity, the Chinese trinket, which is available probably ubiquitously in every city across the planet. Yeah. But one step further to the cultural homogenization. Obviously, countries still and geographically have very distinct cultures. But is it the case that even that might be moving towards more homogeneity and we're losing some of maybe the old ways of thinking, old traditions and behavior? Like I said, I don't know if I have an opinion on this, but it's just whether it's something you've thought about or spoken with other people about.
I think we're always changing our culture. That's what culture is. You're constantly developing it and combining it with new aspects that you learn in other places. Obviously, if you get more choices and you see more alternatives around the world, obviously you will change your own culture in more ways. But that's something that we've always done. Again, when I look throughout history and all the things that we think of as sort of the pure, original, traditional cultures, were always combinations. And as Salman Rushdie put it, it's hodgepodge. It's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And that's always how something new comes into the world, and once it's been there for a while, we start to think of this as the original culture, and then that's challenged in a new way, and we think that that's sad because that old classical thing that was a combination of Mesopotamian and Egyptian and Phoenician culture, which was pure Greek culture, that was, it's a shame that that's now changing again. That's what differs. That's the difference between culture and a museum. And once you reach a certain age, you begin to find that tragic because every change puts you one step closer to being irrelevant and dead. And I can feel that obviously when my old traditional cafes which I cherished when I grew up are. They disappear or they redecorate or something like that. That's awful. But I think that's also how you create something new that the next generation will think of as that's the original, that's the amazing, that's the great thing. There was a study recently, Washington Post wrote about this, how people wrote when they're interviewed about when was the best moment in time when it comes to music. Well, it's the best age for music is obviously between 13 and 20 years old, right? That's always the best, the classical, and nothing will ever be like this. And whatever the kids listen to nowadays, that's not real music. exactly what you were listening to in your formative days. That's the original. And I know that hits hard, because I think that Depeche Mode and Sister Mercy and The Cure, that's the original, that's the best. Nothing, that was peak human experience, and nothing like that will ever be produced again. And the disturbing thing about the Washington Post article, the study that they wrote about, was that goes for literature, that goes for cinema, it goes for moral behavior. If you try to imagine when were people the most decent and honest and hardworking and the best family structures and so on, it was always when people were in their teens to their mid-20s or something like that. And that goes for every generation. So for the boomers, it was the 50s, and they want to go back to the 50s. For me, growing up in the 70s, it's like the 80s. That was the perfect moment in time. But people growing up right now, they will look back on this time as their golden age. and that's because it's you. It's not the world. It's your formative experience. That's when you go to your first concert, you fall in love for the first time, you experience all these things, and it's more important to you than anything else. But then what's interesting is that everything that comes after you're 25 is that's not real culture. It's not something strange has happened to the world. I don't recognize it anymore. And interestingly, everything that happened before you were born was also not as good. And that goes for every generation. And I think I have to remind myself of that when my kids listen to whatever they listen to these days. The language, the TikTok, and I don't get it. But obviously, they will say the same thing to their kids eventually and think that, the first generation on TikTok, that was the golden era. I have to remind myself of that if I want to go with the flow. And instead of just taking pride in not using AI and thinking that I take pride in not having even heard a single song of Taylor Swift. I don't care for that. That's my mistake. That I only hurt myself because I don't know about Taylor Swift, but I know that there are so many exciting things happening in the world. More people than ever who have a longer education than ever in stranger places than I've ever heard of, who have more access to the world's literature and music and creativity and cuisine than ever before. And they add their own creativity to that. It's an amazing world and an amazing experiments going on there constantly. And if I don't tap into that because I think, it was the old cafes that I used to visit when I was 15, that's the best, I only damage myself in that process.
Yeah. No, well said. And that builds upon the same thing. In the face of constant change and the uncertainty of the future, it's really just, do you want to take the risk? Do you want to potentially take on whatever that responsibility might be to try and pursue that life well lived?
Yeah. We just had an Olympics in Paris and centered around the most romantic symbol of Parisian culture ever, the Eiffel Tower. Well, I just read it was the Pessimist's Archive on X who had discovered this combination of artists and writers and citizens of Paris who in 1897 wrote an article complaining how, French culture used to be something amazing and wonderful and beautiful. And now in the middle of the city, you're erecting this monstrosity that will always forever go down in history as the most un-French industrial ugliness ever, the so-called Eiffel Tower. This has got to be dismantled. So again, when was the last thing you started to love something that you first hated?
Yeah, that's a marvelous point. You mentioned as well in those formative years, 13 to 20, not only the cultural experiences you have are going to forever live as the most sentimental, but as well potentially moral behavior. And so I listened to Jonathan Haidt's book, Anxious Generation, which was super eye-opening. I thought gave me so much empathy for people born after 2000, which I dare say maybe some of your kids are. To bring it back to the philosophy of capitalism, is there a way that capitalism can regulate against the consequences of smartphones and the apps that they're using and all the developmental consequences that is quite well documented in this book from it?
Yeah. I think that Jonathan Haidt is one of the most interesting and thoughtful researchers, scholars of our time. So I really take it seriously when he says something. I've learned. I read him before he was sort of Jonathan Haidt with the world and his research in well-being and stuff like that. So I take that seriously. With that said, I do recognize something in this book from what previous generations said about rock and roll music and the car culture, the comic book era, what we in Sweden call the dancing horror of the 40s and 50s when kids met and went dancing, and that would obviously ruin more. Yeah, exactly. It would ruin morals, and people would feel rejected and judged, and it would damage the mental health of people. Now, this time might be different. It might really be something else going on there, and especially when it comes to social media for young girls. It might be that case, and therefore it's about kids. We're going to have to take that seriously. But first of all, we need more research going into this. It seems so far that this is apparently only happening in certain cultures. It seems to be a very American and Anglo-Saxon phenomenon. Might there be something else going on, that this is the generation after the global financial crisis? I don't know. We'll see. And again, it's so important, so we're going to have to take that seriously. But yes, obviously, I can find several problems with, especially social media, where you're constantly being judged, and it's all about fitting in and standing in a perfect balance, which no one will ever find.
And the impossible anxiety on the other end of that.
Yeah.
And then, as Jonathan goes on to say, how they are then performing in the workplace and maybe attitudes towards work.
Yeah, that's right. But is it correlation or is it causation? We also know that apparently not using smartphones at all has been, or very little, has been correlated with mental unhealth in certain degrees. We've seen that sort of a moderate use seems to be the best. Might it be that you turn to your cell phone and to social media more if you feel anxiety about the world, if you don't have sort of your relationships in order in the physical world? I don't know. But what I do know is that we need to learn and we need to adapt to this. And therefore, I don't think, at least for now, we'll see if there's stronger evidence coming out, I don't think a sort of a one-size-fits-all kind of regulation is the answer, but learning and adapting and trying different methods in different schools, for example, I think it's a great thing, trying not banning cell phones in schools and see what happens compared to schools that don't do that. I've noticed that apparently there are changes going on spontaneously, voluntarily. People are adapting and using cell phones and social media less in certain areas if they don't feel like that's a good thing. That, I think, is the most important lesson with open societies. We might not need one-size-fits-all regulations, but learning and trying and to see if there's something better that we can do.
So maybe the sort of harsh truth is that in that process of iteration, there could well be one or two generations that have to carry the burden for everyone else as we get better at using these systems going forward. To bring it back to the philosophy of capitalism, like that would be the self-regulating mechanism.
Yeah, the problem is if we have the And I mean, age limits and stuff like that, we might, perhaps we should take that seriously. But if we're trying to ban it, do we know what happens with these generations in that case? I mean, there's an alternative opportunity cost that we don't see out there. This is to, I mean, what I'm seeing with my kids, it's been an amazing way of also connecting and staying in touch and building new relationships with others. Do we know what we sacrifice and what we're doing to our kids if we stop them from using this? And I don't think that's the way to go about it. But I do think that John Knight's got a very important point, that what we've done as parents and societies to a very damaging degree is that we've stopped kids from exploring the alternatives to the digital social life. We've been helicopter parenting kids to a damaging degree. When I compare what I went through as a kid, what we got to do, what we got to explore, and being out in an unparented, uncontrolled manner, just going about our own business and meeting strangers and doing things, which was obviously dangerous and risky, but it probably also built some resilience and gave us opportunities to engage in an unsupervised social life that was overall, it came with some damage as well, but overall probably good for our development. And I think Haidt has got a point that we should have more free-range kids. And if we don't do that, obviously social media is what they've got, and that's a bad thing. But when I say that, you also hear that what that sounds like to most people is that, oh, we're sacrificing a couple of generations by having them being free-range kids with all the risks and all the bad meetings and all the traffic injury that might appear from that. So there are no perfect solutions. There are only trade-offs in this world.
That's Thomas Sowell, right?
Yeah, I think it is.
Look, you've been so generous with your time, and I don't want to just go on, because I feel like actually in some of these questions, they've tangentially also answered some of these other questions. So let's finish it off with 3 or 4 sort of faster ones, you know,
sure.
Less you needing to make the case for X, but rather just what do you think about Y?
Yeah.
Has Nassim Taleb affected your worldview at all?
Well, you know, I read him quite a lot after the global financial crisis, because I think that he was onto something important there. And when it comes to learning lessons about how it's not how we avoid mistakes, but how we build anti-fragile systems, I think that's a lesson both for me as an individual and for societies, definitely.
So just anti-fragile? Nothing to do with maybe his idea of the Lindy phenomenon, the precautionary principle, the minority rule? Have these also been, you know, little nice pithy phrases that he's coined that you've been able to identify and then incorporate into your work?
You know, I think that most of that, and I started reading with, is it Fooled by Randomness, which once upon a time, I think they've all been buried deeply into my almost unconscious parts of my brain, and they keep appearing.
That's
and I do
something,
recognize things like that.
I mean, what a tremendous achievement.
Yeah, and it goes back, you just mentioned Thomas Sowell. He's that kind of author where I have phrases and quotes of ways of thinking that I suddenly realized that, oh, I got that from Thomas Sowell or from Taleb.
Okay, so Thomas Sowell, does he sit on your Mount Rushmore as most influential people in your worldview?
It depends on how many people I get to have on my Mount Rushmore. Only 4. I would love to have a bigger Mount Rushmore in that case. But I'd say perhaps to me. We've talked about Ayn Rand, how she's influenced me in an almost philosophical, literary way. One person who definitely belongs in my Mount Rushmore is Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian thinker and economist, who really taught me about epistemic humility and Socratic wisdom in all kinds of ways, and how culture and society and the economy, how we just don't know. So let's try to build institutions that help us to do more things based on what we don't know and find out more things. I was quite resistant to that originally because, when you're 20, you know everything. And I really disliked his way of telling me that, look, we don't even know how our own brains function. So how could we predict the rest of the world? But that has really informed everything that I do. So those are two people on my Mount Rushmore. You might have Saul there as well.
Nice. Right at the beginning of the conversation, you said something that I wrote down, which you just jogged back to memory. But you mentioned that there are institutions that protect civilization. So I just wonder what you were talking about when you said that.
I'm obsessed with trying to make the world safe for progress. And I've learned that progress comes from being open to surprises and weird people coming up with unexpected innovations when it comes to the intellectual sphere, when it comes to technology, when it comes to business models and stuff like that. So that takes a specific set of institutions. It takes institutions that doesn't try to predict, that doesn't try to impose one size fits all, that doesn't try to perfect the technologies and business models that we're having now, but allows us to constantly challenge them. And it's the open society and the free market. When it comes to the specifics, it's the rule of law. It's property rights. It's open and free trade, so that we can constantly challenge the incumbents. Those are the institutions that make the world safe for surprises. The things that I wouldn't predict, and possibly from people that I don't like because I find them weird, and trying to protect, give them a safe room to experiment with things that I hesitate to embrace, that protect civilizations.
All right, Johan. 3 I try to ask every guest. The first being, if you could interview any two people of history, rather sit as a fly in the wall for an interview between any two people of history, who do you want to listen to?
I would love to have a conversation between Aristotle and basically anyone. He could sit there and talk to himself. But I'd say Hitchens is not a bad choice. And if you... why Aristotle? Well, because he... I have to say, the most brilliant mind in human history, combining being the first empirical scientist with this obsessive curiosity about the natural world, everything from sort of snails and fish to what makes the planets and the stars move the way they do, to politics, and explore all the different Greek city-states and trying to come up with, to understand more of it. And all the while inventing basically logic so that we find a way to accumulate knowledge about this. It just blows my mind. And human morality, Nicomachean Ethics is still one of the best works on friendship, morality, and love that I've ever read. So that would be exciting to see him talk to anyone. Hitchens, not a bad choice. Leonardo da Vinci would be exciting, another curious guy in history. So yeah, something like that.
That's a phenomenal answer. Thank you. Final question. What is a country you're particularly bullish on?
Wow. Can I mention two?
Sure.
Argentina might just, after having been one of the richest countries on the planet, then having experienced 60 years of terrible stagnation and economic disaster, might just turn the corner, and we don't know what's going to happen under a real crazy guy, President Milei. But it takes a crazy guy to challenge those institutions, the Peronist party, and so on. He might just get the macroeconomics in order and get Argentina to function again. It's still, with all the mess it's been through, it's one of the most beautiful and warm and interesting countries on the planet. If they get the economy in order, it will be the place to. If I can mention one more, I'm constantly excited by Vietnam.
Love that.
I mean, it's a communist dictatorship, but it's a communist dictatorship where when I enter and there's the wrong number in my visa, it's not the same as the passport. They've made a mistake at the embassy in Sweden. They call in their superiors, and what they do is that they take a bottle of Tipex and just erase the numbers and write the right ones into it. I mean, they can't uphold any kind of despotic authoritarian system with that kind of cultural mentality. They're far too warm and kind and decent. And you see that in the culture, in the economy. The moment that there are cracks in that wall, they create amazing everything from art and architecture to economic progress.
I think high-tech manufacturing now as well.
Absolutely. They've gone from rice and coffee to sort of being a big exporter in high-tech and taking lots of business from China right now. If they began to dismantle more of that sort of the authoritarian structures, I think they will be one of the real tigers in the world economy.
I'm so stoked you said that. I think after almost 200 interviews, that might be the first Vietnamese entrant that we have. You spent a bit of time with Milei, right?
Yeah, I was there at the conference where he was the keynote speaker, and I didn't get that much time with him. All his fans there wanted a piece of him, but I got to meet his circle of people and advisors and stuff like that. And I'll tell you this: there's a method to the madness, and I was more bullish on Argentina and what they're trying to do after I was there than before, because there's a social media persona which is wild and crazy, and as a Swede, I think there's too many swear words and too much aggression out there. But I think there's a real serious and a much more pragmatic, actually, attitude to how to make the reforms stick that impressed me. So there might be a chance.
Unbelievable. You've been so generous with your time. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this with me, and as well for being so open with your answers.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, mate.
It was fun.